with genuinely reliable, genuinely socialist leaders that stand for a fundamental change in society.
Alan, before this crisis took place, we thought the more the countries like Pakistan, maybe there would be a change or a revolution. Now it's other way around. We see Europe is on the move, and European working classes is more maybe in the arena right now. Which country do you think could first explode?
Now that's an interesting question. You see, in the past, you'd have revolutionary movements in one country or another country, but it would be singular cases. And you might argue, well, it's an exception, It's no longer the case. If you look at the entire world now, you will see the same process or similar processes are taking place at different speeds. And everywhere you see a crisis of the capitalist system. And everywhere you see at least the beginnings of a movement of the people. You saw this in Pakistan at the time when Benazir Bhutto returned. That was a clear indication. After the assassination of Benazir Bhutto, there was an enormous upheaval. It shows a colossal anger which is building up, justifiable anger at the conditions which exist. But you see it in many countries. You see it in India. You see it in Bangladesh. You see it in Europe, certainly. In France, in Italy. There have been huge demonstrations. Even in little Iceland, which is a tiny little island with a very high living standard, If you'd have asked me 12 months ago, what's the least likely candidate for a revolution, you'd have said Iceland. Not anymore. Iceland has collapsed. The economy has collapsed. And it's the first example where people came out on the streets and overthrew the government. Now, that's in Iceland. Now, if that can happen in Iceland, it can happen in any country in the world. And that will happen inevitably. There will be a movement, I predict now, in the direction of a revolution, by which I mean a fundamental change in society, because a fundamental change is what is necessary.
Alan, let's suppose in one country people overthrow this existing economic setup.
Yeah.
How would that one country exist? Don't you think that the whole world would be ranged against them?
Well, socialism is international. It always was. And nowadays the frontiers really don't mean very much. I mean, capital moves around the world. It's the same as you move from the front room of your house to the kitchen. Frontiers have become increasingly meaningless. And therefore I would argue that any fundamental change on socialist, on the lines of genuine socialism, by which we mean democratic socialism, in any country would provoke a chain reaction elsewhere. If one takes this subcontinent, any movement, important movement that took place in Pakistan must have an effect in India, for example. Instead of dividing the peoples, which is constantly taking place, what difference is there between an Indian worker and a peasant and a Pakistani worker, peasant, unemployed person? Very little difference, I would say. In other words, the real struggle that is taking place in the world today is not a clash of civilizations. That's nonsense. It's not a national question. It's not a clash between nationalities. The real contradiction, the real war that is taking place is a war between the rich and the poor on a world scale. And therefore I believe in what Karl Marx said, that the workers have no country. The workers have no country. And that the class interests, of course, are far more important than any other question of language or race or religion which may divide us. In other words, we stand for the unity of the working class and the unity of the struggle for socialism on a world scale.
Alan, a bit about UK, because UK is also hit very hard and you are coming from UK.
Yes.
What is the situation over there politically? And there is a shifts reportedly to the left in the unions and all that.
Yes.
So what's happening over there in UK?
Well, Britain is an interesting case because there was a country in which they were boasting. Gordon Brown in particular was bragging and boasting for a long time that the boom-bust cycle had finished. Britain was okay. Britain would avoid a crisis. They say the same thing as what they say in Pakistan. Britain was supposed to avoid a crisis. Now it's the opposite. The IMF produced figures last week. They made a statement that the crisis in Britain is deeper than any other country of the advanced countries and would last longer than any other country. It's a very severe crisis. Because they based themselves on the banks, on the finance sector, they thought they were being clever. Britain in the past was the workshop of the world. It was an industrial nation. Not anymore. The industry's been destroyed, as it's been destroyed in Pakistan. They tried to base themselves on services and finance, and so that's collapsed. And therefore the crisis is hitting Britain very, very hard. They're talking now about 3 million unemployed. Perhaps it'll be more than 3 million unemployed in the next 12 months. Now this again must provoke an enormous movement of opposition. I believe it started. There were a series of illegal strikes which took place a couple of weeks ago, against the wishes not just of it was against the law, it was against the government, it was against the trade union leaders. They tried to argue that it was anti-foreigner. It was not. That's entirely false.
Oh yes.
There were strikes to protect jobs, strikes against unemployment. And I think that similar movements are taking place, factory occupations, even in Canada, even in the United States. In Chicago there was a factory occupation. So this indicates a worldwide movement of people reacting to the crisis of capitalism in order to defend themselves. These are defensive struggles, but defensive struggles, as any general knows, can be transformed into offensive struggles at a certain stage. And I believe that also will occur.
And this situation looks same in UK as well, because there are no three main parties, Conservative and the Labour. There's no qualitative difference between both the parties, and now these liberals have just emerged. So how people would get their expression, their own political expression, the workers over there?
Well, the Liberal Party is a very small party, of course. The main party is the Conservatives and the Labour Party. Now, the Labour Party historically was based upon the trade unions and the working class. It was supposed to stand for socialism, as the PPP is supposed to stand for socialism. And therefore, when the people vote, they would vote for the Labour Party. Unfortunately, the leaders of the Labour Party have pursued a policy which is a capitalist policy, which is not fundamentally different from the policy of the Conservatives, and therefore the Labour Party is in serious trouble. They could quite likely lose the next election. The Conservatives would win, in which case, of course, the situation would be even worse. And therefore the problem is one of leadership. We have parties. We have big parties created we have trade unions. The problem is that the leaders of these parties do not do what the people want them to do. And this is a problem which must be addressed.
So you think that gap needs to be bridged between the leadership and
I'm old-fashioned. I believe that the leaders of a party should do what they're supposed to do. They should not come into power and then forget about the people.
Or maybe the working class must look for its own leadership.
There's no question of that. There's no question of that. But first of all, I think it's necessary to make the point that where these organizations exist, these are mass organizations, the rank and file, the workers must ensure that the leaders do what they're supposed to do, or else they must remove them and replace them by a leadership that will do what it intends to do.
Thank you very much, Alan, for enlightening us on a lot of issues, and thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.